President Donald Trump. He faced intense questioning from the House Judiciary Committee in his first public appearance before lawmakers. Smith pushed back on claims that he was, quote, a crooked prosecutor.
Okay, so let me take you through something that actually happened in March 2024, and it stands as the most specifically alarming available real-world expression of what the idea of Capitol Hill on fire with lawmakers demanding the arrest of Trump Inner Circle members most accurately captures in its most formally grounded, most institutionally consequential available form. Peter Navarro, who served as a former Trump White House trade advisor, began serving a 4-month sentence at a federal prison in Miami after being convicted of contempt of Congress for ignoring a subpoena from the January 6th committee. This was not some abstract scenario or hypothetical drama. It was an actual Trump Inner Circle member placed in an actual federal prison for actually defying an actual congressional subpoena. Major outlets like CNN reported on this jailing as a significant moment, emphasizing that Trump's inner circle is not immune from consequences and that future aides may think twice before simply blowing off Congress. This event carries weight because it demonstrates, in the clearest possible terms, that defying congressional oversight can lead to real personal accountability, including time behind bars. The conviction and sentencing were not framed as some partisan vendetta against the president, but as an enforcement of institutional norms that apply regardless of political affiliation. At the same time, we saw discussions around how Democrats backed special counsel Jack Smith in certain investigations related to the 2020 election interference and January 6th events. Lawmakers at times described his work as defending democracy through probing claims of election interference, with evidence presented suggesting that former President Trump knew his allegations of widespread fraud were untrue when he continued to spread them, that the violence on January 6 was foreseeable, and that it was exploited in the aftermath. The proof offered in various proceedings aimed to show intent and awareness at the highest levels. This combination of documented actions creates a picture that is far more grounded than any fictional dramatization of mass arrests or emergency caucus meetings calling for immediate warrants. The real story here is not a made-up scenario of lawmakers from both parties rushing to demand arrest warrants for Trump's chief of staff, legal advisors, and campaign officials in dramatic press gaggles or heated sessions. Those kinds of vivid, speculative depictions are often labeled as fictional or exaggerated for effect by political commentary channels. What is documented and real is Peter Navarro actually serving that 4-month federal prison sentence, as reported by CNN and other credible sources. What is documented and real is Steve Bannon being convicted on 2 counts of contempt of Congress for refusing to cooperate with the January 6th panel, with outlets like the BBC noting the potential jail consequences. What is documented and real is the House of Representatives voting 220 to 203 to hold Navarro and Dan Scavino in criminal contempt of Congress and referring the matter to the Justice Department, as covered by NPR. What is documented and real is the January 6th committee issuing criminal referrals for Donald Trump and John Eastman on serious charges including obstruction of an official proceeding, conspiracy to defraud the United States, making false statements, and aiding an insurrection, according to CBS reporting. And what is also documented is the Trump-era Department of Justice attempting to pursue indictments against Democratic lawmakers over alleged illegal orders or related videos, only for a grand jury to refuse to indict, as reported by Reuters and the New York Times. Every one of these elements is verifiable through established journalistic records from multiple outlets including NBC, AP, PBS, and the BBC. Together, they form the most comprehensively alarming available picture of congressional contempt accountability in action, showing how institutional mechanisms can produce tangible consequences, even for senior figures in a former administration. The significance of Navarro's jailing cannot be overstated as a journalistic assessment of institutional precedent. CNN's characterization of it as a significant moment highlights that Trump's inner circle is not above the law and that future aides might hesitate before defying Congress. This framing is the most formally available assessment because it directly ties the personal consequence of federal imprisonment to the fundamental congressional oversight power. The prison sentence establishes a deterrent signal, showing that the assumption of immunity from serious repercussions for ignoring subpoenas is no longer as reliable as it might once have seemed. Historically, congressional contempt referrals happen more often than actual federal convictions leading to prison time for former senior executive branch officials. The rarity of actual imprisonment makes Navarro's case stand out as a powerful example. It shifts the calculation for anyone in a similar position, demonstrating that defiance can lead not just to legal proceedings, but to concrete time served in a federal facility. This precedent operates within a clearly defined institutional pathway that deserves close examination because it reveals how accountability can unfold in practice. That pathway follows a structured four-step process rooted in the separation of powers. First, Congress issues a subpoena to a specific witness, requiring testimony and document production. When the witness defies it, the House can vote to fine them in contempt. That finding leads to a criminal referral transmitted to the Justice Department for potential prosecution. Finally, the DOJ can pursue federal criminal proceedings that may result in conviction and sentencing. In Navarro's case, every single step of this chain was completed and documented across multiple reliable sources. The subpoena was issued, the defiance was clear, the House voted on contempt, the referral went to the DOJ, prosecution followed, conviction was secured, and the prison sentence was imposed. This full documentation across CNN, NBC, NPR, and others provides the most credible institutional confirmation of how the contempt mechanism can produce real outcomes. The rare nature of imprisonment for such figures amplifies its deterrent effect, challenging prior assumptions that senior executive personnel could ignore congressional demands without facing the most serious consequences. It forces a reevaluation of compliance calculations for anyone who might receive future subpoenas in high-stakes oversight contexts. Equally important is the role of DOJ prosecutorial discretion in this process. Congressional contempt referrals are not automatic triggers for prosecution. They depend on the Justice Department's decision to act. In Navarro's situation, the DOJ chose to proceed, which proved decisive in turning the referral into actual conviction and prison time. This discretion acts as the critical variable determining whether congressional action translates into personal accountability. It can be influenced by political considerations, raising concerns about selectivity or interference, especially in polarized environments. When exercised in favor of prosecution, as it was here, it reinforces the chain's effectiveness. When it leans toward protection or delay, it can limit outcomes. The tension between congressional pressure and DOJ independence creates a dynamic that shapes realistic accountability trajectories. In urgent oversight contexts, this variable becomes central to predicting whether future referrals will lead to similar results or stall out. Another dimension worth exploring in depth is the broader pattern of what some describe as both sides attempting to weaponize criminal processes. The documented attempt by the Trump DOJ to indict Democratic lawmakers over alleged illegal orders or videos, followed by a grand jury's refusal to issue indictments, provides a mirror image that highlights institutional checks. Reuters and the New York Times covered this development, showing that even when a DOJ pursues cases against political opponents, independent actors like grand juries can serve as a safeguard. The grand jury's refusal to indict stands as a formal check on potentially politically motivated prosecutions, demonstrating that not every theory advanced by prosecutors meets the threshold for criminal charges. This independence helps maintain public perception of fairness in the accountability system. It suggests that while partisan pressures exist on all sides, certain institutional actors can resist being fully co-opted, refusing to cross into what they view as insufficiently supported actions. This dynamic adds nuance to discussions of weaponization, showing that the system includes layers designed to filter out weak or overly political cases. Building on these established precedents, there has been public discussion from lawmakers about the need to go further up the chain. This means moving beyond figures like Navarro and Bannon toward even more senior members of the Trump inner circle in future accountability efforts. Such demands are not treating the contempt convictions as the final ceiling, but as a foundation for escalation. They signal an appetite for deeper scrutiny, leveraging the documented chain to push for broader application. This forward-looking momentum reflects how real-world precedents can fuel calls for more comprehensive investigations and referrals. Rather than remaining static, the accountability process shows potential for expansion, where initial successes or high-profile cases encourage further action. The fictional Capitol Hill on fire imagery of mass arrests and emergency demands compresses this escalating trajectory into a dramatic visual, but the underlying reality is a more measured yet persistent institutional progression rooted in verifiable events. To bring this full circle, there are several clear, concrete points that capture the essence of what these developments establish. First, Peter Navarro beginning his 4-month sentence in a Miami federal prison in March 2024 for contempt of Congress, alongside Steve Bannon's conviction on 2 counts and the House's 220 to 203 vote to refer cases for prosecution, collectively establish a precedent that Trump's inner circle is not immune from consequences. The historically rare character of actual prison time serves as the most alarming deterrent signal for future members facing subpoenas. It challenges any lingering assumption of blanket protection and sets a new benchmark for compliance in congressional oversight. Sources across the spectrum documented these events, reinforcing their credibility and the institutional weight they carry. Second, the 4-step contempt accountability chain, from subpoena issuance through House contempt finding, criminal referral to the DOJ, and eventual federal conviction and sentencing, combined with the pivotal role of prosecutorial discretion, outlines the most realistic future trajectory for inner circle accountability. Navarro's case documents every link in that chain, confirming that when the DOJ exercises discretion toward prosecution, congressional mechanisms can deliver consequential personal outcomes. This full documentation makes the pathway credible and provides a template for understanding how similar situations might unfold. It underscores that accountability is not guaranteed but becomes far more likely when institutional actors align in favor of enforcement rather than protection. Third, the Trump DOJ's attempt to target Democratic lawmakers with indictments over alleged illegal orders or videos, only for a grand jury to refuse, establishes a key institutional check against political weaponization of prosecutions. This refusal highlights the independence of grand juries as a buffer, confirming that politically motivated theories may not always clear the evidentiary threshold. It serves as a broadly significant signal that the system retains mechanisms to prevent unchecked partisan use of criminal justice tools applying across party lines. The documentation from Reuters and the New York Times lends weight to this as a credible example of institutional restraint in action. Fourth, as this story continues to develop, several specific developments are worth monitoring closely. Watch for any additional defiance of congressional subpoenas by current or future Trump administration officials, as this will indicate whether the Navarro and Bannon precedents are fostering greater compliance or continued resistance, directly influencing the likelihood of more referrals and prosecutions. Pay attention to prosecutorial decisions on pending or new contempt referrals, since these will reveal how the discretion variable is being applied and whether it advances or contains escalation towards senior figures. Track any new January 6th related criminal proceedings to see if the criminal referrals for Trump and Eastman on charges like obstruction, conspiracy, false statements, and aiding insurrection translate into active cases or grand jury actions. Finally, observe the broader grand jury landscape for patterns of refusals to indict in politically charged matters, as these will expand or limit the checks on weaponization across both Democratic and Republican targets. At the absolute bottom line, Peter Navarro served real federal prison time for contempt of Congress, making him one of the most senior Trump inner circle members to face such a consequence for defying a subpoena. Steve Bannon faced conviction on similar charges. The House took formal action with a clear majority vote on referrals. Criminal referrals reached high levels with serious charge categories. A major outlet framed the prison sentence as a significant moment with deterrent implications for the inner circle. Attempts at cross-party indictments were checked by grand jury independence, and calls continue for going further up the chain in accountability efforts. These elements combine to represent the most specifically alarming and comprehensively documented real-world expression of congressional contempt mechanisms producing historically significant outcomes for former senior advisors. While dramatic fictional scenarios imagine instant mass arrests and fiery Capitol Hill confrontations, the documented record shows a more deliberate institutional process with real consequences already imposed and potential for further development. This accountability story is part of the larger fabric of American separation of powers, where Congress exercises oversight, the executive faces scrutiny, and the justice system navigates complex political pressures. The events of 2024, centered on contempt proceedings tied to January 6th investigations, illustrate how these branches interact in practice rather than in theory. Defiance of subpoenas tests the limits of congressional authority, while prosecutions and convictions test whether that authority carries enforceable weight. Deterrence emerges not from rhetoric alone, but from tangible results like prison sentences that signal to others in similar positions that consequences can be personal and severe. At the same time, checks like grand jury refusals prevent the system from descending into pure tit-for-tat weaponization, preserving at least some perception of fairness even amid deep divisions. Expanding on the contempt chain further, it is worth noting how each step builds institutional momentum. A subpoena represents Congress asserting its investigative power, a core function for informing legislation and checking executive actions. Defiance triggers the contempt finding, which is a formal declaration that the witness has obstructed legislative duties. The referral to the DOJ shifts the matter into the criminal realm, where prosecutors must weigh evidence, resources, and public interest. Conviction and sentencing close the loop, turning legislative frustration into judicial enforcement. In Navarro's instance, this progression was not rushed or symbolic. It followed standard procedures and resulted in actual incarceration. Multiple news organizations corroborated the timeline and details, from the initial subpoena resistance through the House vote, DOJ action, trial, and eventual imprisonment in Miami. This multi-source validation strengthens the case that the process was not invented for political theater, but operated as designed within the constitutional framework. The deterrent effect ripples outward. Future aides or advisors weighing whether to comply with subpoenas now have a concrete example of what non-compliance can cost: months in federal prison, public conviction on contempt charges, and a permanent mark on their record. Even if political loyalties run deep, the personal risk calculation changes when imprisonment becomes a realized outcome rather than a distant threat. This shift is especially relevant in eras of heightened polarization, where oversight inquiries often touch on sensitive topics like election integrity, campaign activities, or executive decision-making. The signal is clear: institutional norms have teeth, and ignoring them can lead to isolation from normal life, even for those who once operated at the highest levels of power. On the prosecutorial discretion side, the Navarro precedent highlights both the power and the vulnerability of that stage. Discretion allows the DOJ to prioritize cases based on merit, feasibility, and broader justice considerations. In politically sensitive matters, however, it invites accusations of bias, either for pursuing aggressively or for declining to act. When the DOJ moved forward with Navarro, it validated the congressional referral and completed the accountability loop. Had it declined, the process might have ended with a largely symbolic House vote. This variability means that future trajectories depend heavily on who controls the DOJ and how they interpret their role. In one administration, discretion might favor enforcement of contempt findings against opponents. In another, it might shield allies. The resulting uncertainty adds tension to the system, but also underscores why public scrutiny and journalistic documentation remain essential for transparency. The mirror dynamic with Democratic targets adds balance to the narrative. When the Trump DOJ sought indictments related to alleged illegal orders or videos involving Democratic lawmakers, the grand jury's refusal acted as an independent filter. Grand juries, composed of ordinary citizens, review evidence in secret and decide whether probable cause exists for charges. Their refusal here suggested that the presented theory did not meet even that relatively low threshold in their assessment. This outcome serves as evidence that not all prosecutorial initiatives succeed, particularly when they appear driven more by political scoring than by robust evidence. It counters narratives of one-sided weaponization by showing that institutional safeguards can function even under pressure from the executive branch. Documentation by reputable outlets like Reuters and the New York Times ensures this episode is not easily dismissed as rumor or spin, embedding it in the formal record of accountability efforts during that period. Looking ahead to the going further up the chain demands, these reflect a natural progression in serious oversight inquiries. Initial contempt cases against advisors like Navarro and Bannon establish that the mechanism works at lower or mid-levels of the inner circle. Success there emboldens calls to apply the same standards higher up, targeting chief of staff roles, legal teams, or campaign strategists if evidence warrants. This escalation is not automatic or guaranteed. It still requires fresh subpoenas, votes, referrals, and prosecutorial will. But the precedents create momentum, making it harder to argue that accountability should stop at peripheral figures. In fictional depictions, this might manifest as chaotic scenes of lawmakers demanding immediate arrests amid Capitol Hill on fire chaos, with emergency meetings and press scrums. In reality, it unfolds through procedural steps, hearings, votes, and court proceedings, slower, more bureaucratic, but potentially more enduring in their institutional impact. Monitoring future developments will be key to assessing whether this momentum builds or dissipates. Additional subpoena defiance would test the strength of the deterrent established by Navarro's imprisonment. If more officials comply readily, it suggests the precedent is taking hold. Persistent resistance could lead to more referrals and cases. Prosecutorial decisions on existing or new referrals will reveal whether discretion tilts toward advancement or containment. New proceedings tied to January 6th referrals could show whether broad charges like obstruction or conspiracy gain traction in active litigation, and patterns in grand jury actions across party lines would indicate the robustness of checks against overreach. Each of these elements contributes to a larger picture of how congressional oversight intersects with criminal justice in modern American politics. Ultimately, the story of these contempt proceedings and related referrals offers a window into the resilience and tensions of democratic institutions. It shows that even in highly charged political climates, mechanisms exist for enforcing accountability, imposing consequences, and providing checks. Peter Navarro's time in federal prison stands as a landmark example, not because it was the most dramatic or widespread action, but because it was real, documented, and consequential for a senior figure. Combined with Bannon's conviction, House votes, criminal referrals, and the grand jury check on the other side, it paints a complex but grounded portrait of institutional processes at work. The deterrent signal, the procedural chain, the discretion variable, and the escalation potential all interact to shape future outcomes. While no single event resolves deeper political divisions, these documented steps demonstrate that the system can produce tangible results rather than endless talk. This does not mean the process is flawless or immune to criticism. Questions about timing, selectivity, and political motivations persist on all sides. Some view the contempt cases as legitimate enforcement of oversight. Others see them as selective targeting. Similarly, attempts at cross-party indictments raise concerns about retaliation or weaponization. The grand jury refusal provides one layer of protection, but broader trust in institutions requires consistent application of standards regardless of who holds power. Journalistic coverage from diverse outlets helps by providing verifiable facts, timelines, and context that allow individuals to form their own assessments rather than relying on partisan framing alone. In reflecting on the full scope, it becomes clear that the most alarming aspect is not any single fictional scenario of fiery confrontations or mass demands for arrests. Instead, it is the quiet, procedural reality of a former senior advisor actually serving prison time for contempt, setting a precedent that could influence behavior at the highest levels. It is the completion of the accountability chain in a documented case. It is the interplay between congressional action and DOJ decisions. It is the existence of checks that prevent total partisan capture, and it is the ongoing calls to extend scrutiny further, building on what has already been established. These elements together create a more nuanced and consequential narrative than any dramatized version could convey. The events tied to March 2024 and surrounding developments continue to resonate because they touch on fundamental questions of power, oversight, and the rule of law. How far does congressional authority extend in compelling testimony from executive figures? When does defiance cross into criminal territory warranting prosecution? How does the justice system balance independence with political realities? Navarro's sentence, Bannon's conviction, the House vote, the referrals, and the grand jury action provide concrete data points for debating these issues. They show the system in motion, producing outcomes that affect real people and shape future expectations. As developments unfold, staying informed through credible, multi-sourced reporting remains essential. The institutional record built from these cases offers a foundation for understanding potential trajectories without resorting to speculation or exaggeration. Whether accountability escalates further up the chain or stabilizes around existing precedents will depend on the interaction of subpoenas, votes, prosecutorial choices, and judicial processes. What is certain is that the documented actions of 2024 have already altered the landscape, demonstrating that inner circle members can face real consequences and that institutional mechanisms have the capacity to enforce compliance in meaningful ways. In the end, the combination of these factors represents one of the most significant available expressions of congressional contempt accountability in recent history. It underscores that while political battles often generate heat and dramatic rhetoric, the underlying processes can deliver measured but impactful results. Peter Navarro's imprisonment serves as a pivotal marker, not just for one individual, but for the broader precedent it establishes regarding the limits of defiance and the reach of oversight. Paired with the other documented elements, it invites ongoing reflection on how American institutions navigate accountability in an era of intense division. The story is not over, and its full implications will continue to reveal themselves through future actions and decisions within the constitutional framework.